After 6 months with Linux, one writer shares the ugly truth about gaming without Windows. Also, you can't take your open source code back. We need to clear up this open source myth once and for all. Also, Microsoft continues efforts to support open source. They joined the OpenChain platform. And Canonical Snapd has a vulnerability. It's called Dirty Sock, and it gives root access in Linux. Also, voidlinux wants you to know voidlinux.eu, which was their former domain, that's no longer theirs. How did they lose it? We're going to discuss that. These are 5 stories that I will be taking into account. And the first story on the docket tonight is we have a writer over at Forbes.com. Many of you have been following this guy, this writer, Jason Evangelo. Great writer for Forbes.com. About 6 months ago, he really kind of came on the scene for those of us that follow Linux news because he has been a Windows user, I guess, all of his life. And 6 months ago, he switched to Linux. And he has been writing about Linux since he made the switch. On Forbes.com. Forbes, of course, is a major publication, right? It's a major news publication, a major website, and the fact that we have somebody like Jason Evangelo writing for a site like Forbes.com giving Linux coverage is really fascinating, especially coming from a Windows user perspective, because quite frankly, that kind of stuff usually gets more eyeballs than anything like long-time Linux users, like my videos, for example. I come at it from somebody that's been using Linux for over a decade. Nobody wants to hear the kind of geeky stuff, that I talk about, but people love when somebody makes the switch from Windows or Mac to Linux. How's it going for them? That typically gets a lot more readers or a lot more viewers on video. And Jason Evangelo, a lot of people have been following him ever since he made the switch. I've been keeping up with a lot of his stories on Forbes because I find it kind of fascinating because it's been so long since I was a new to Linux user. Sometimes I forget how challenging it can be in the early days. So he writes, 6 months with Linux, the ugly truth about gaming, quote, without Windows. So just reading very briefly here from his article, quote, I've been striving to exclusively use desktop Linux for the past 6 months, and I'm not leaving it anytime soon. The experience has been transformative, educational, and downright fun at times, etc., etc. Then he also mentions, but lest you think it's all sugar-coated, headache-free computing utopia, I'm here to remind you that while I consider myself a Linux advocate, so he loves Linux, he's probably never going back to Windows, but quote, I'm also a critic. So he's about to tell us basically about gaming on Linux and why it's not as good as Windows. I think we already know this, those of us that have tried to live on, that do live on Linux and gaming on Linux, although it's gotten so much better than it was a couple of years ago, certainly much better than it was 5 years ago, and gaming on Linux was non-existent 10 years ago. Still, we have a lot of room to improve. So 10 years ago, when I started on Linux, there were no games on Linux. Gaming on Linux was non-existent. All you had was a handful of free and open source software games out there. Super Tux Kart, right? That's the big one. It's been around forever. Super Tux Kart, that was about the best game we have. Super Tux Kart is a great game. Other than that, we had about 50 first-person shooters that were all based on Quake. We had a lot of open source Quake-like first-person shooters. That was it. That was way before Steam on Linux, And then I guess 4 or 5 years ago, Steam started making their Linux client, and that changed gaming on Linux overnight. And of course, the big change, the big leap forward that we just had, in the past couple of months, past few months here, was Proton. And Proton, like overnight, we went from having about 1,000 games on Steam that were playable on Linux to now well over 3,000 because of all the Windows-only games that we can play because of Proton. And once we really get Proton more mature and we can play pretty much all the Windows games, you're talking 5,000-6,000 games that'll be available for us. So that is completely different than, again, when I first started in Linux, where we had 0 games. So gaming on Linux has come such a far distance. Now, and of course, other than Steam, Jason Evangelo here mentions, of course, we have Lutris, which lets you install clients like Origin and play those games with just a few clicks. But Jason says the problem with gaming on Linux is not lack of games now. There's a ton of games, right? We have games. The problem is video drivers. And he has a point. So the first thing he wants to discuss, of course, is NVIDIA. The NVIDIA puzzle says, quote, in the Linux world, there are proprietary and open source drivers for both AMD and NVIDIA graphics cards. And what he's talking about here specifically with NVIDIA. So I have an NVIDIA card. If you use an NVIDIA card, even though there are open source drivers called the Nouveau drivers for NVIDIA, they suck. They suck bad. I mean, they are almost unusable. They're usable if you want to use the open source Nouveau drivers if you don't game or do anything really graphically intensive on your system. Like if all you do is open up a web browser, go to Facebook, yeah, the Nouveau drivers might be okay for you. But the minute you start, you're never going to game with the Nouveau drivers. You have to have the proprietary NVIDIA drivers. Matter of fact, I don't know anybody that spends real money on the higher end NVIDIA cards that doesn't use the proprietary drivers. Again, the open source drivers are just not good. And Jason included a Phoronix benchmark here. And this basically demonstrates how bad the Nouveau drivers here. The Nouveau drivers are the purple. And the blue drivers are the proprietary, and these benchmarks, yes, the bigger values are actually the better values. So the proprietary drivers just blow away the Nouveau drivers. It's not even close. You have to use the proprietary NVIDIA drivers. Most Linux distros are not going to ship proprietary software out of the box. They just won't. For principle, Ubuntu, Debian, Fedora, they only ship with free software. So how do you get the NVIDIA driver? Well, on some user-friendly distros like Ubuntu, Mint, Pop! OS, all the Linux distros that base off of Ubuntu, there is a pretty easy way to do it. You go to the software and update tool, click on additional drivers, and there you will see an NVIDIA proprietary driver listed. You click on it, it'll take a couple of minutes to download and install, reboot your machine, and now you're on the proprietary driver. But even as easy as that is this something that a kind of new to Linux user would even know to do? Probably not. It's not like Ubuntu beats you over the head and says, hey, you need to install the NVIDIA drivers, as soon as you finish installing the system. No, they don't even mention, hey, you might want the proprietary drivers. Nothing ever pops up and says that. Certainly people that are not very computer savvy, they really don't even know anything about the drivers that make the video card work, right? And we're talking about the easy to use distros like Ubuntu. Distros like Debian and Fedora are not going to have these software and update additional driver utilities like Ubuntu does. I mean, you're going to have to go out of your way to add a repo, to download the proprietary drivers. This is not user friendly, right? This is not going to ever attract the masses to Linux having to do stuff like this. Now that is the problem with NVIDIA. Now AMD, let's discuss the AMD problem. AMD also has open source drivers and proprietary drivers. The situation is a little different in AMD because the open source drivers are fantastic in Linux. The open source AMD drivers in many cases are better than the AMD proprietary drivers. As crazy as that sounds, so most people just run the open source drivers. And if you run the open source drivers, the open source AMD drivers, you don't have to install anything because the open source drivers are baked into the Linux kernel. You never have to worry about installing them, updating them though. And this is the same situation for the NVIDIA drivers as well. Proton, Steam and Proton are maturing at a rapid rate, right? They're always getting better, new features, Vulkan. You always need the latest and greatest Linux kernel, which we're not going to discuss today about the kernel as far as gaming, but you always need the latest video drivers. You always need that latest NVIDIA driver, and you always need that latest AMD driver if you're running an AMD card. Now, you're not going to get the latest. For example, NVIDIA again. If I was on Ubuntu and I install the proprietary NVIDIA driver, it is going to be NVIDIA 390, I believe, was the version. Yeah. And Proton now requires NVIDIA 415. So how do you get that? Well, for one thing, you need to know something like PPAs exist in Ubuntu. Most new users don't know anything about a PPA. They don't know what that is, or, how to even go about adding a PPA to your sources and So you have to add a PPA to get that latest NVIDIA driver that Steam and Proton require. The same thing with AMD. You're going to have to go and add a PPA to get that latest driver, especially if you're on one of these really new AMD cards, like the new Radeon 7 that just came out, or the recent, Vega 56 and Vega 64. You need those latest drivers. Otherwise, your Steam and Proton experience just won't be good. So Jason Evangelo, again, he's only been on Linux for 6 months, and he writes, as user-friendly as Linux has become, and it has become a lot more user-friendly than it was just a few years ago, gaming still requires some guesswork. Most people are not going to know the difference between open source and proprietary drivers, the difference between NVIDIA, AMD, depending on which one you're running, Team Red, Team Green, how is that going to affect your gaming experience. Also, some of this changes how to install the drivers and stuff, varies from distro to distro. There's nothing consistent in Linux. And for new to Linux users, this is a confusing situation, and one I think we can still improve on. And the second story on the docket tonight is, no, you can't take your open source code back. For some reason, this myth has been propagated out there on the internet, especially over the last year with the FreeBSD code of conduct controversy and then the Linux kernel code of conduct controversy. Is we have a lot of people out there that have contributed open source code and they think, I can just take my code back. I can take my ball and go home. No, you can't. I don't know why we still have to explain this, but Stephen J. Vaughn Nichols over at ZDNet, he took the time to explain it, and he also consulted with some lawyers to make sure that he had some legal backing on this. So he writes, the blurb at the top here, a popular note on the Linux kernel mailing list claims that a program's author can block people from using his code at his discretion. Wrong. So somebody, I guess, is mad at the Linux kernel team, probably over the code of conduct. And some people, they're still unclear about what the GPL actually grants as far as your rights, also what it protects you from. So we have this fella named Mikey USA. It's a username. It's not an actual name, but it might actually be his real name. Anyway, he licensed a program under an open source license. I believe he licensed it under the GPL 2. Anyway, it's just an obscure kind of slot game, video game. It's very old. It hasn't been updated in like a decade. Nobody plays it. Nobody's interested in his game anyway. It's this long past dead. But anyway, he claims that he is rescinding that particular program's GPL v2 license from some people and, quote, from anyone who adds a code of conduct anywhere near my code to fight sexism. End of quote. So he doesn't like the code of conduct that the Linux kernel team has added. So he says, you know what? I'm taking my code. I'm going home, right? I'm rescinding the GPL 2. What used to be open source is no longer open source. Nobody can use it. Now, again, this text-based casino game has no players, and it's pretty much a dead project. This guy, it's not like anybody really cares about the particular software he's talking about. But the debate it sparked, he sparked this debate over on the Linux kernel mailing list, and it has been the hottest topic really in the last few days, is basically this. The issue of whether one person can just block users from using their code once it has been licensed under an open source license like the GPL version 2. And this bothered a lot of people over on the kernel mailing list. It kind of bothers me that, again, people don't understand what licenses like the GPL actually give you, what they grant you, and what they prevent you from doing with your source code. When the code of conduct controversy came around a few months ago, Richard Stallman famously had some comments about it. He said, quote, the developers of Linux or any free program can remove any and all code at any time without giving a reason. But Richard also added, however, this doesn't force others to delete that code from their own versions of the program. So you have a piece of open source software and it's licensed under the GPL. And one day you decide, you know what? I'm rescinding that license. I'm going to slap a proprietary license on it, or I'm just going to just take the code and I don't even want it out in the public anymore. Well, guess what? If I had already copied that program, I had already taken that program as licensed under the GPL, I'm already modifying it, distributing it myself, maybe under a different name or whatever, that's fine. You can't take that code from me. It was free when you put it out there. It's still free when I used it. If it's licensed under the GPL, anybody that gets that code from me, it's free for them to use it. That's how the license is designed. That's what makes the license a free license. Stephen J. Vaughn Nichols writes, quote, "In short, once you've opened up your code, you can't close Pandora's copyright box." So once it's out there, it's out there. So Stephen J. Vaughn Nichols decided he wanted an actual lawyer to clarify these things, or somebody that specializes in free licenses. So he contacted the Software Freedom Conservancy, their executive director, Kieran Sandler, and to get some clarification specifically regarding the GPL v2, which was what this guy had his software license under. And what he got was this response, quote, "The GPL v2 says by modifying or distributing the program or any work based on the program, you indicate your acceptance of this license to do so, and all its terms and conditions for copying, distributing, modifying the program, or works based on the program." So when you slap that free license on your code, you agreed to that license. It applies to you just the same as anybody that uses that code. You are no different than the person that comes and gets that code from you using that license to modify it, distribute it, whatever they want to do. So just because you wrote the code, you hold no special place, really. That's the beauty of free and open source software, and that's the beauty of these free licenses like the GPL v2. You can't take it back. It's not revocable. It's not a revocable license. For anybody wondering about the GPL version 3, it is even more clear regarding the GPL v3, because the license itself says, quote, "All rights granted under this license are granted for the term of copyright on the program and are irrevocable provided the stated conditions are met." So that's it. These rights are granted to everybody that ever comes across this program, this software. You can never revoke this license. So if you're one of these people mad about codes of conduct and you think you can just take your code, no, you can't. If you wanted to have complete and total control of your code and prevent people from using it as they see fit, guess what? You shouldn't have licensed it under a free license. If you licensed it under the GPL or the MIT license or the Apache license or the BSD license, guess what? Game over. It's out there. Anybody that's already, copied your GitHub or whatever, they don't have to delete that code. It's theirs. It was free when they got it. It will always be free. Anybody that ever gets it from those people, etc., etc. And one last thing is the fact that other than, it's kind of strange that people don't get the licensing, as far as the legal agreement that is these free licenses. What's really strange is that people want to hold code hostage. They think because they don't agree with something out there that you can combat that by threatening to remove code or, again, holding code or a program hostage. That is just childish to me, and I can't understand why people think that's even a good idea. And the third story on the docket tonight is the story of Microsoft joining the OpenChain platform. We need to discuss what is the OpenChain. OpenChain is actually part of the Linux Foundation itself. It's basically a group that helps people navigate the legal ramifications of open source licenses. Kind of like we were just discussing, these people that don't understand certain open source and free licenses. The OpenChain project is there to help people navigate some of these hurdles that come up, especially with big projects. So we've got over at the Microsoft open source blog, basically the announcement that Microsoft joined the OpenChain community. I'm not going to read much from this because most of this is just fluff and, marketing speak. There is an actual news article about it, though, in several publications, but I'm reading from Tech Radar. So this was written by Anthony Spatafora. And as always, of course, I'm going to have all the articles I discuss on today's show in the show description. So, Microsoft has announced that they've joined this OpenChain project as a platinum member, the highest level member. Now, what are the other like platinum level membership companies for the OpenChain project? Well, they include companies like Uber, Google, Facebook. Not exactly like champions of open source. I mean, I guess neither is Microsoft, but Google is debatable. Uber, why is Uber a platinum member of the OpenChain network? That's strange. Facebook, or they're not doing anything with open source at all. It's kind of strange. But anyway, that's not really the main point of the story. Is the OpenChain projects, that their main objective, quote, is to bring improved clarity to open source software licenses, as licensing issues often present a huge hurdle for a business's legal team. So companies need assurance that their open source software they use is in compliance with all the rules and regulations that govern its use to prevent potential litigation. So it's basically to help corporations from getting sued, that deal with open source software. So what is this a big deal, right? Is Microsoft joining the OpenChain platform as a platinum member, is it a big deal? Well, to be honest, the OpenChain project is not something most people have ever heard about, even as a free and open source advocate myself. I don't know anything about the OpenChain project. It's not on that level as other things you've heard of, like, for example, throwing this out there, the Free Software Foundation. Anybody that is a free software advocate or open source software advocate knows about the Free Software Foundation and the work they do. Does the OpenChain project do anything in collaboration with the Free Software Project? Or what about the Open Source Initiative that I discussed on last week's episode, the OSI, which helped clarify what constitutes a open source license and what does not constitute as an open source license? Does the OpenChain project have anything to do with the Open Source Initiative? Do any of these organizations really work together? Probably not. And quite frankly, the OpenChain project is probably much smaller than either one of those two groups I just named, the Free Software Foundation and the Open Source Initiative. So I would feel better about Microsoft being a part of those organizations than this OpenChain project, which is kind of like a subsection of the Linux Foundation that most people have never even heard of, the OpenChain project. So I like that, again, Microsoft is really doing a lot with open source. They've open sourced so much of their stuff, Windows excluded, but so much of what Microsoft does is open source these days. I really think it's time to embrace them into the open source community. So I do think it's a good thing. I just don't think it's gigantic news. And the fourth story on the docket tonight is gigantic news. So let's talk about the vulnerability that we found in Snapd. Snapd, of course, is the Snap daemon for installing Snap packages. So it's the Canonical, the company behind Ubuntu, created Snapd and your Snap packs and all of that. And Snapd has a vulnerability, if I can speak, vulnerability that gives root access in Linux. So we have this new vulnerability called Dirty Sock. Love the name. This new vulnerability, it's in the REST API for Canonical's Snapd daemon, and it can allow attackers to gain root access on Linux machines. So, and before we go any further, we should clarify, even though the title is Canonical's Snapd daemon, because Canonical created Snapd, a lot of distros have Snapd installed on them, it have snaps available to install right out of the box. But even if you don't, a lot of people just add the Snapd daemon. I added it on my Manjaro install because I have Snap packs, flat packs, app images, everything on my Manjaro install. Because I have Snapd on my system, I was vulnerable to this particular exploit, this Dirty Sock exploit here. So this doesn't just affect Ubuntu. Any system that has Snapd on it was affected by this. I say was because Canonical very quickly fixed it. I think within hours they were able to patch this. So if you do have Snapd on your system, hopefully you've run an update by now. This particular bug was discovered by a security researcher named Chris Moberly of the Missing Link Security in Australia. So he told Bleeping Computer, who is the website here I'm reading the article from, he told Bleeping Computer in an interview that while he tested it only on Ubuntu, other Linux servers would almost certainly be affected too. So again, because it's a snapd thing. So as long as snapd is on your system, you are affected by this. It's not just for Ubuntu users. Now, even though it would affect anybody that had snapd on the system, because Linux distros vary wildly, right? The exploitation, how you get into the system, does vary from distro to distro. For example, on Ubuntu and Ubuntu flavors, the API that this exploit was taking advantage of, it actually uses a backend Linux command called add user. Many of you guys know what the add user command is. It is to create a user on your Ubuntu machine. It's basically a shell command. Add user is not available on every distro. So if you're on a distro that does not have that add user command, then somebody would have to go about this a little bit differently to gain root access to your machine. Why do they need the add user command? Well, as you can probably guess, this exploit involves creating a new user on the system. That user is going to have root access to your machine. And of course, once somebody has gained root access to your machine, that's pretty much game over. They can do whatever they want with your machine at that point. My final word on this is that the researcher that discovered this vulnerability wanted to let everybody know that, quote, Canonical was great and that they were a pleasure to work with, unquote. So Canonical, they were happy that this guy reached out to them, and they were really quick and helpful, and they patch this thing very quickly, so that's always good. A lot of these people, these security experts and researchers, when they discover these vulnerabilities, they really don't like it when the companies that they let know, hey, your software is broken, it's wide open, and sometimes they don't react quick enough. Apparently Canonical acted very quickly in this case. Again, within hours they were able to get this thing patched. Everybody's machine should be patched by now, as long as you took an update. And the fifth and final story on the docket tonight is about Void Linux. So Void Linux, about a year ago, Void Linux lost their main dev. And when I say lost their main dev, I don't mean he passed away or anything. I mean he disappeared. Nobody knew what happened to him, whether he was alive, dead, in jail. Since then, he kind of showed back up on the scene as far as they know he's alive. I don't think he's back working on the project, but he disappeared for months. Nobody knew anything about the guy, and he had the keys to everything, the keys to GitHub and website, and because he was basically the lead dev, but he was really the main dev, the only dev. There were other people that I guess that worked on Void Linux, but as is often the case with these smaller projects, one guy basically runs the whole show. And when he disappeared, it really caused a lot of problems with Void Linux. And one of the problems they're facing now is that voidlinux.eu was the Void Linux website. When Void Linux first came on the scene, that was the domain name. Well, nobody knew about it, but the domain expired, that particular domain. Nobody knew it expired. Nobody paid for the bill, the registry bill for that domain name. And the Void Linux guys, they lost that domain. So they posted this actually a couple of months back, but a lot of people are still confused about it. So the Void Linux guys keep putting it out there in the public on forums because it keeps coming up over and over again. Voidlinux.eu is not ours. Quote, we would like to warn people of a domain that is no longer under Void Linux control. Voidlinux.eu lapsed in its original registration and was purchased by an unknown third party before the Void Linux people could regain ownership. At this time, please assume that anything involving voidlinux.eu is not related to Void Linux and should be considered potentially malicious. Of course, if the person who owns the domain now would like to transfer it to our control, we'd be grateful, and we'll update voidlinux.org to indicate if this happens. Our official domain, though, is now voidlinux.org. So voidlinux.org is the official website of Void Linux. Now, voidlinux.eu was previously, but they didn't pay the bill. They didn't pay the registry bill. And for those of you that are not familiar with how domain names work, you pay yearly for a domain name. Well, you can pay multi-yearly. I think you can pay 2 years at a time or whatever. But anyway, after a certain time period goes by, you have to pay the bill again. If you don't, you lose that domain name you registered, voidlinux.eu in this case. And when you lose it, it's free for anybody to register again. It just is back out there. Anybody can now grab voidlinux.eu, and that's what happened. They didn't pay the bill. Nobody, I guess, got the notice because every register sends you notices, hey, the registration is about to lapse. You need to pay us. I guess it was the original dev maybe that was getting that. Who knows? But somewhere along the way, they lost that domain. And sadly, this happens to a lot of smaller free and open source projects, is because sometimes these small teams, sometimes it's teams of only one person, they're not paying attention, or they're so wrapped up in code, right? All they want to do is write code. They don't want to handle the administrative stuff of like paying the bills, right? Or running a website or whatever it is that needs to be done. So unfortunately, you see this with a lot of these projects. They have these lapses where all of a sudden they lose their website because they lose their domain name. Void Linux is not the first of this to happen. I mentioned sometimes that they struggle just operating a website or a web forum or what have you. Void Linux has had this problem. The forums will go down sometimes. That's not uncommon with other, especially smaller Linux distros. Sometimes you go to their site, their site's down, their forum's down. Slackware, which has a very small development team, I remember, was a couple of years back, Slackware, their entire website was down for, it seemed like weeks. I mean, it was a while. And the Slackware guys are an interesting group because, do we even really need a website? We can just get by without a website. Well, yes, you can, but it's not the greatest look for yourself as a project when you can't maintain a website or even just pay your hosting bills or your domain register bills. So I think what more of these projects need to do is they often ask for help, right? They ask for people to help them join the team. And usually when they want you to join the team, they want you to contribute things like code or artwork, translations. Some of these projects need to focus on asking for help with some of this other stuff, the administrative stuff, and especially website administration stuff, because this is something that too many of these projects are lacking. And again, it just doesn't, it's not a professional kind of look. People coming from, Windows and Mac, and they see what some of these Linux distributions, especially these projects, and the site's looking bad, site doesn't work half the time, the forum's down, so they get hacked. The Linux forums get hacked all the time. Mint had their forum hacked. The Gentoo guys had their GitHub hacked. They need to pay more attention on that side of things, not just focus solely on code. And that was the fifth and final story on the docket tonight. So this was Taking Into Account, episode 29. I try to release a new episode of Taking Into Account every Thursday, so look for Taking Into Account episode 30 sometime next Thursday. As always, I like to end these episodes of Taking Into Account by reading a viewer question or comment. A lot of times these viewer questions or comments come from Mastodon. I have, about 900 followers over on Mastodon. I really like interacting with you guys over on Mastodon. It is my social media network of choice. Love Mastodon. Anyway, I get this message from Mastodon. It's a private message, so I won't share it on screen or share the name here, but hi DT, I've been following your series of videos on tiling window managers. I love how they work. I tried i3 and loved it, but I always seem to run into some issue I don't know how to fix. And I also share computers with people who live with me. It's hard enough to get them to use Linux, but a tiling window manager would be impossible. Is there any way to get the same window tiling features on a regular desktop environment? I use KDE and tried many plugins and online guides, but none of them work as smoothly as i3. Maybe there are other alternatives I am not aware of. So, he has a family computer. A lot of people share the computer. They all been using KDE, but now he's discovered i3 and he loves i3. Can he get KDE, I guess, to function like i3? So he still has all that tiling functionality, but the family members can still use KDE? Well, you're going about this the wrong way. You don't need to try to hack KDE into i3. For one thing, you're not going to be successful. KDE uses a floating window manager. It's never going to be a tiling window manager, no matter what you do to it. It's just not. Same thing, you're not going to make i3 a floating window manager going the other way. If you like i3, what you need to do is just use i3. And your family members, if you're using a login manager like LightDM, all they need to do is choose KDE Plasma when they log in. And they can log into KDE. And when you log into the machine, you choose i3. Now, you're probably on a single user system, and maybe that's why this is a problem. Well, just add users, right? If your wife or your husband or your kids, just go ahead and add a new user to the machine. If it's on, like most Linux distros, there's GUI ways of doing this. In Ubuntu, there's an add user program. Just, add a user for everybody, and they can log into whatever desktop environment or window manager they want to use, and it's a problem solved. Because quite frankly, I don't think you're going to get KDE to ever function entirely like i3. That's a battle I think you're just going to lose. Before I go, this show was made possible by Ansem, Carlos, Chris, Douglas, Dylan, Leo, Rob, Robert, and Tony. They are the producers of this show. They are my highest tiered patrons over on Patreon. Without them, none of this would be possible. This show was also brought to you by all those other fine ladies and gentlemen. All those names you see on the screen, they are the supporters of this channel. If you'd like to support my work, please consider doing so. You'll find me over on Patreon. You'll find me at DistroTube over on Patreon. Peace, guys.